technical security mechanisms for cyber-physical attacks, for cyber-physical systems, they do not need to be fancy new designs like new intrusion detection systems that take into account the physics, so the physical characteristics of a system, and accordingly decide if there is some kind of suspicious behavior. They can be much more conventional, so they can be normal anti-malware systems. There will be encryption, there will be whitelisting. So all of these things that we're expecting to see in conventional computer systems, we see in a similar way here. Perhaps there might be differences in the emphasis, differences in the configurations, but the ideas are the same, the motivation is the same, so the rationale is the same behind them. So starting with anti-malware. Anti-malware is first of all, about preventing. So it can be non-technical. For example, it can be awareness programs in an organization. So it's about building awareness among the employees about cyber hygiene, about not opening suspicious emails, about not clicking on hyperlinks that come from unknown places, from suspicious places, not visiting websites that may contain malicious content, and so on. So it's about prevention in a non-technical way to a large extent, but it can also be in a technical way. So, for example, it might be using things like, or approaches like, hypersegmentation, where the network is designed in such a way that it is so segmented and so that it is difficult when malware actually infects it. For the malware, it is difficult to spread, to move from one segment to another of this network. It can be things like black networks, which are difficult for an attacker to navigate, so as to be able to, so the attacker will not be able to plant the malware perhaps in the best place for them. So they can be both technical and non-technical prevention systems. But let's say that we haven't managed to prevent them. Let's say that there is malware there, and we have to do something about it. So first of all, we have to detect malware. And if we detect malware, then we need to identify what malware it is and then try to remove it. So the standard approach here is by using antivirus, and or I'll call it anti-malware here to be more general, but really most people tend to use the term antivirus for everything. So antivirus systems that tend to be signature-based, they tend to be knowledge-based. So they would scan the contents of the file, and according to the scanning, they would compare against a blacklist. So effectively, it is like an IDS where there is a knowledge base behind it. There is a dictionary of known threats. Well, it's similar with anti-malware. There is the equivalent of a dictionary of malware, and effectively a blacklist of known malware. And if the contents of the file resemble the contents of that malware or a malware, then this is presumed to be malware. For industrial control systems, the malware signatures may first be downloaded on an isolated computer and then be applied to the control network's computers in a manual way. This is because if things happen in an automated way in an industrial control system, then we do not know whether there might be a difference in the behavior of the system. So that difference might affect the physical properties of the system, might affect physically what it is controlling. So for that reason, they tend to be things, so updates of ICS, of industrial control systems in terms of malware signatures, tend to be done offline rather than online. And then the opposite to blacklisting. So if we consider anti-malware to be a typical type of blacklisting, we could say the same perhaps about intrusion detection systems that are knowledge-based rather than behavior-based. So all of these, they tend to be based on blacklisting. However, blacklisting assumes that there is the possibility, there is the energy even for updating the blacklist. And the blacklist will be massive, of course. We're talking about blacklists of malware. We're talking about blacklists of, let's say, different attacks in the case of intrusion detection systems. So these will be massive lists, and they need to be updated every day, or perhaps very often, if not every day. So for this to happen effectively and efficiently, that's not very easy when something is an industrial control system that is meant to have 99.999% availability and needs to be online all the time. It's very difficult to keep updating these things. So instead another approach that is very often recommended for SCADA systems, for industrial control systems, is to use whitelisting. So the opposite of blacklisting. In whitelisting, we do not specify what should be on the blacklist. We do not specify what should not be seen. What we specify is what should be allowed. So, for example, which file or which directory, or which software vendor is trusted, or which application is trusted, or maybe not trusted, but which application, or perhaps actually not only being trusted, but which application should be on this SCADA system, on this industrial control system. So this is a whitelisting approach. We say what is allowed rather than what is not allowed. And it makes sense for such systems. It makes sense for SCADA systems. It would probably not make sense for a conventional computer, perhaps a family computer, because you cannot have a whitelist of every possible application that you will ever need. Perhaps in a family context, you could, for the rest of the family, have someone perhaps who would set up a whitelist, but that's not really realistic, is it? It's not really practical. For a SCADA system, though, it is practical, because a SCADA system is not expected to be doing any kind of general purpose, let's say, video making or image editing or filling in Microsoft Word documents. That's not what a SCADA system would do. So it makes sense to limit its applications to a whitelist, because these are the 3, 4, 10, 20 perhaps applications that are meant to run on this SCADA system. Perhaps on the human-machine interface of a SCADA system. So if these are the allowed ones, then surely there can be a whitelist. And if something else attempts to run, then that can be presumed to be malware, or at least suspicious. So this is the logic in whitelisting for systems that do not need many applications to run on them. You can have, in this way, in fact, you can even have protection against zero-day attacks. It doesn't matter if the anti-malware knows about this attack. Simply the fact that it is trying to run a program to execute something that it was not meant to, that is not on the whitelist, that's enough to block a zero-day attack. So that makes whitelisting extremely attractive for industrial control systems and generally for safety critical systems of this type. And if we extend the logic to networks, not just applications, but to the network traffic in a system, then we can have network flow whitelisting. So in the same way we whitelisted the applications, so this application can run, the other cannot run, or any other cannot run. We can have the same for the network flows. We can say that if network traffic comes from somewhere, well, it should be on the whitelist, and that whitelist might have, for example, the source and the destination of network traffic. If then the network traffic that we see has this source and this destination and it belongs to a whitelist, then it is fine. If not, we can assume that it is suspicious network flow that should not be there. And this, I mean, from a technical perspective, this can be considered as a special case of a firewall configuration, or it can be considered as a special case of behavior specification intrusion detection system, where it is the human expert that determines the network flows that are legitimate, or actually all the network flows that can be legitimate, so all the whitelist. And the most common recommendation for SCADA in this context is block everything unless it is a specifically enabled communication. So the same as you would see in firewall configurations, of course. And this makes it extremely meaningful for cyber-physical systems networks, because, for example, in a vehicle or perhaps in an industrial control network, there is no reason to have a network flow outside of these that are expected, because the network traffic tends to be repetitive, tends to be predictable, and it's not like we will have connections to pretty much every destination in the world as we can have in a conventional PC. So it's not like a SCADA system is meant to visit Facebook. So there is no reason, for example, to receive any traffic from Facebook or to send any traffic to Facebook for that matter. Now, the most common technical security mechanism that is expected to be seen in any system, in any conventional system, in any type of communication that has any need for security, it tends to be cryptography. So this is the primary practice for protecting confidentiality, the primary practice for protecting integrity, authenticity. In fact, for the vast majority of security principles, cryptography tends to be the solution or one good solution. Cryptography is about encryption, which is the process of transforming ordinary text, which we call plain text, let's say it's English in this case, and transform it into a coded form, so some kind of non-English, so ciphertext. And decryption is the reverse. So decryption is about transforming the coded form, the ciphertext, into plain text. Now, cryptography is, we call it an art and a science, so it is the art and science of designing ciphers Now, ciphers, these are the algorithms that are used to encrypt and decrypt messages. So these are the cryptographic systems. This is how we do the cryptography, how we do the encryption. This is how we do the decryption. And all modern ciphers, they use secret keys, they use keys, which are bits, sequences of bits, like 01110001, for example, could be one sequence of bits, one key. And depending on these keys, this is what determines the output of a cipher. So let's say I want to send a secret message to someone, or I want to let's say, encrypt a document. Then I will apply this cipher on the data. The data is the document, the contents of the document. So I will apply the cipher, I will apply this cryptographic system, whichever it is, on the document. And the output, which will be the cipher text, will depend on the key I will use. So it is not possible for someone, or it's not easy anyway, for someone to decrypt this information, to decrypt this document, unless they have the secret key, unless they have the key. So it is the key that actually determines the strength of an encryption to a large extent. There are two different types of ciphers. We have always had symmetric ciphers, which is using the same secret key in order to encrypt and decrypt. Now, in symmetric ciphers, the analogy would be a door. So locking the door and unlocking the door, you might use the same key. Well, it's the same in cryptography with symmetric ciphers. You use the same secret key to encrypt and decrypt. So that makes sense if the owner is the person who would like to encrypt and decrypt of the document, or in other cases where you can trust sharing the secret key. In asymmetric ciphers, which are much more recent, things are very different. So here we have two keys. We have one key that is secret, that should remain secret, and this is the private key, and one key which is meant to be shared, which is the public key. So this is public key cryptography, and here we can have anyone being able to encrypt a message using the public key because it is shared, it is not secret, but only the owner of that specific private key in this private-public pair, only the owner of the private key can decrypt it. So anyone can send a message to this person, but this person only can decrypt the message, because only the private key can decrypt it, while the public key is what is used to encrypt it. So this is what has allowed many technologies to come out of asymmetric ciphers. For a start, we can have online shopping. It wouldn't make sense to keep sharing our secret key every time we need to buy something from an online shop. But with asymmetric ciphers, this is possible because we use the public key, and it is the private key that does the decryption, let's say, of the bank card details. And this asymmetric cryptography has led to many other things. It has led to digital signatures, for example. So digital signatures is when one can use a private signature key and apply a particular digital signing algorithm on a message so as to produce the digital signature of that message. So this proves the authenticity, and it is something that anyone can check. So it proves the authenticity of the document, and anyone can check the authenticity of the document because they can use the public key of that individual. It has also allowed the introduction of the digital certificate. The digital certificate is an electronic document which is digitally signed by some trusted agency. We call this a certificate authority, and it proves that someone does indeed own that specific public key. So the public key is what is used to check the authenticity of the digital signature, and it is the digital certificate that is used to prove the ownership of that specific public key. Now, all of this is nice, but it is possible to steal these digital certificates. And when this happens, it can have dramatic consequences. In fact, Stuxnet used stolen digital certificates from trusted companies, so well-known companies, so as to evade anti-malware protection. So this anti-malware protection would look at the digital certificates, would see that they come from a trusted company, and would allow the software to run. So this is how Stuxnet. This is one of the mechanisms that Stuxnet used. In fact, this is something that then started becoming a trend just after Stuxnet. So many high-profile criminal malware operations are using the same approach of using stolen digital certificates. But now in cyber-physical systems, the cryptography is not perhaps as straightforward, one would say, as in conventional computer systems, as in, let's say, online shopping. It's not the same, because it takes energy. It takes time, but mainly it takes energy. So inside the car, the CAN messages on the CAN bus, they are usually sent in plain text. They're normally sent in plain text. Encryption cannot be afforded by the in-vehicle ECUs, by the electronic control units in there, because they don't have the processing capacity, perhaps, or because of the strict real-time requirements. Because encrypting and decrypting something with a strong encryption mechanism, at least, would take time. Not much time, but some time. And some time cannot be afforded inside a critical in-vehicle network. So we don't tend to see encryption much inside cars, apart from the obvious one, which is to authenticate the user, which is to unlock the vehicle, basically. So the immobilizer will use, so disabling the immobilizer, that process will use cryptography. But beyond that, there is not much in terms of cryptography inside the vehicle. Similar limitations are expected in medical devices. They tend to be very resource-constrained systems, so one would not expect much in terms of protecting from the perspective of encryption. It would, if there is something that, if having this additional processing of encrypting and decrypting would spend energy, that would deplete the battery, and that of course would be highly inconvenient, especially for implantable medical devices. So changing the battery is not that simple for an implantable medical device. And if cryptography leads to needing more operations, so that there is more often a configuration of the medical device, or because the battery is being depleted, well, that's not very good for that user. So in this case, it might be better to lose some of the cyber security so that the physical safety is not compromised in this way. So limited processing power and the need to minimize latency in all these areas means that there is almost never asymmetric cryptography. So what we see in some cases is symmetric cryptography and very short secret keys. Now this is important because the length of the secret key is what is largely determining the strength of cryptography. So beyond the type, there's also the size, and it's the length really that matters. And there cannot be very long secret keys if there are resource constraints, or if there are real-time, strict real-time requirements of this type. So unlocking a car tends not to use cryptography of the same level as buying something online. So you would never see, let's say, more than 128 bits in a secret key used for such a purpose. But of course, the lower the length, so the shorter the secret key, the easier it is to break, the easier it is to crack. Now, of course, there is always new research for these types of problems. So if it is not possible to have encryption everywhere, if it is not possible to have the processing power for encrypting everything inside the vehicle, let's say, or inside another kind of such safety critical system, then what people have created is dedicated hardware, which is separate to the rest of the vehicle, let's say, separate to the rest of the car. And this dedicated hardware on the car, it does only that. It does only cryptography. So effectively, it is about offloading the task of managing the secret keys and performing all the cryptographic operations on separate hardware. So that would be a separate physical device inside the car that would do all the cryptographic operations. And now let's say that all of this has failed. Let's say that the intrusion detection system failed, that the firewall failed, that the anti-malware failed, that the encryption failed. Let's say that everything has failed. Now what needs to be done is to have some kind of survivability plans, some kind of survivability mechanisms. Now concepts related to these are many, there are many. Resilience is one of them, dependability, fault tolerance, intrusion tolerance. All of these are terms that are very related, but let's use the term survivability for this one. So survivability is about the ability to operate correctly, or as correctly as possible anyway, with minimal performance degradation, even if malicious actors have compromised parts of the system. So we have failed to prevent the attack, but we try to minimize the impact of this attack, in this case with survivability, so ensure that we continue operating to an acceptable degree despite the attack. And there are different types of survivability mechanisms. One of the recommended ones is diversity. So diversity is about using redundant critical components with deliberate differences between them. So it's not just redundancy. Diversity is not the same as redundancy. It is not the same as having two cables or two identical systems. It's about having two different systems. So one system perhaps running something on a different operating system than the other. So that is diversity, because if malware affects the one type of operating system, well, it is unlikely that it will affect in the same way the other type of system. Or it is about having both wireless and wired communications at the same time. So if the one is affected by jamming, let's say, the wireless one, then the wired one will not be affected. So this diversity can create a degree of survivability. And what it does is that it addresses mainly integrity and availability. Why? Availability is obvious, because if you have a second system, then that takes care of availability in case the first one fails. But in terms of integrity, this is because you can have diversity of sensor technologies. So you can have a sensor, for example, that is based on laser, on LiDAR, and a sensor that is based on ultrasound, on ultrasonic. These two might be measuring the same thing. Let's say that they are measuring the distance from an object. Now, if an attack, a physical attack, affects the one, then it cannot realistically affect the other two in the same way, because they are technologies that use a completely different physical properties in order to measure something. So they would have to both be attacked in order for both to be out of action, in a sense. So this diversity is creating a sense of it creates a level of integrity, because we can check the values coming from the one sensor, whether they make sense against the values coming from another sensor. So there is an element of checking the accuracy of sensor data, so the integrity, so in case they have been manipulated, this sensor data, by having a diversity of sensor technologies. Beyond diversity, we can have a hot standby. So hot standby is when we have two systems, a primary system and the hot standby system that is waiting. It runs in parallel with the primary system, and if and when the primary system fails, let's say the main SCADA server, if the main SCADA server fails, then there will be a hot standby SCADA server which takes over when it senses that the primary one has malfunctioned. So there is this element of hot standby. It is waiting, it is running there in parallel and waiting until it is needed. So what it addresses this is availability, of course, because if the first one becomes unavailable, then the second one will be there to take over. And it is commonly used for this reason in safety critical systems inside aircraft, of course, and of course in industrial control systems of significant criticality. Beyond this, or actually no, it's not beyond this, it's extending the concept of the hot standby and slightly modifying it. So this is a replication. So this is when we have multiple near exact replicas of the critical components that we're more interested in. So if some of these critical components, let's say some of the RTUs, some of the SCADA servers are compromised, some of the ECUs perhaps, if these are compromised, then the other replicas will maintain an acceptable performance and help flag the misbehaving ones. So they have two functions in there. The other replicas, they act as standbys in a sense, or they take over the rest of the tasks that cannot anymore be performed by the critical components that have failed, that have been attacked. But they also help in this way to flag the misbehaving ones, perhaps by voting, perhaps by having some kind of reputation or a voting system where all the different replicas are checking the same values, and if some see completely different values, then they might say, well, this one or two systems, they tend to have very different values from the rest of us, so we have voted that they look suspicious. So in this case, by having a replication, by having near exact replicas of these systems, we can both have an acceptable performance in the case of lack of availability, but we can also check for integrity by comparing the values between them. And they have been proven, these types of systems have been proven experimentally for SCADA network firewalls. They have been proven for SCADA master applications. They are also proposed for military vehicles. So these are ideas that are commonly seen in the context of cyber-physical attacks. And let's assume now that everything has failed, even survivability has failed. So there's nothing working now in the system, and we need to take a decision as to what to do. So here there are two possible directions, two completely different routes of next step. The first one is fail-safe. So fail-safe is what we do if every protection fails. So where we resort to is a fail-safe behavior that prevents any kind of unexpected or excessive physical damage. So let's say that we have a drone that senses with its onboard systems perhaps, that it senses that it is under attack, or that simply has lost connection. So it is a drone that has lost connection to its operator, and it needs to decide what it will do. Well, the logical behavior for fail-safe behavior for a drone will be either to land autonomously, if it still can do that, or to return to base. So these are the fail-safe. This is the type of fail-safe behavior that is expected for a drone if there is any kind of failure, or if there is any kind of cyber attack that is detected on it. And if it is a remote surgery robotic arm, well, the likely fail-safe behavior is to shut down, and of course also report the error. But automatically shut down is the logical fail-safe behavior. But there is not only fail-safe; there is also fail-secure. Now, fail-secure and fail-safe, they have similar logic in a sense, but they do exactly the opposite. It's almost a trade-off in a sense. So in the event of a system's failure, when we have a fail-secure system, then the logic is that nobody should have access to the system or to the data. So the classic example that we have now between fail-safe and fail-secure is, what do we do in a building entry system if everything fails? So what should we do by default if the building entry system fails? If it is an access control system in a building and it fails? Well, there are two different ways. There is the fail-secure, which means lock all the doors to ensure that no unauthorized person will enter the building, and also no person will exit the building. So there are two sides for this. So no unauthorized person will enter, and no person in general will exit the building. So this is the fail-secure. Or fail-safe, which is open all the doors to ensure that everyone can get out in case of a fire. So that's the fail-safe. So what do we do in the case of fail-safe and fail-secure? What's the most common for building entry systems? Well, clearly fail-safe for health and safety is what beats security every time, unless it's a government or military kind of building of some sort. Fail-safe comes ahead of fail-secure. So this is something that, of course, criminals know, and they know that to open all doors, one way to do this is to trigger some kind of fire detection system. So this is what it triggers the fail-safe, and in this way all the doors might open.